Good afternoon and welcome to the 77th episode of Navigating Turbulent Times. My name is Sophie Hooper and I'm the Head of Policy at IWFM. Once again, I'm joined by an excellent panel and I will let them introduce themselves in a moment. We all know the numbers. 40% global CO2 emissions come from buildings. 75% of the global workforce works in buildings. 80% of energy use of a building's life cycle is done in the operational and from the life cycle. 35% of the total volume of waste generated comes from buildings. Now, listening to those numbers, it's clear that the solution to reduce carbon will need to come from people within the built environment, and especially those managing buildings. Professions and industry alike will need to step forward to help make a difference across the sustainability agenda, and especially the net zero agenda, if we stand a chance at keeping temperatures at a sustainable level. Now, our own trends in the Market Outlook Survey and Sustainability Survey show that there is a real opportunity for the profession to deliver positive business outcomes. And we pose that FMs are agents of change for delivering sustainability outcomes, as they are the linchpin bringing together the needs of landlords, users, and the supply chain. Now, the challenge is for FM to increase the value of its role by understanding carbon measurement and taking a higher responsibility for emissions, driving the holistic strategic approach for their organizations. Now, our research points towards the conclusion that doing this will allow the FM to engage more in the strategic future of the business, positioning themselves more as providers of positive outcomes beyond operational solution, and therefore driving up its value, something that we have been posing since the Startup Review. Now, similarly, the SFMI, the Sustainable FM Index, and BAM FM are pushing the industry to really understand what the relationship of FM could be with business carbon emissions. They are nearing the release of a series of tools, stress tested by a variety of professional organizations and bodies, including ourselves, IWFM. And these tools will help push FMs to understand its impact on carbon, especially in the Scope 3 arena, and will push FM to engage with the business in the strategically important carbon agenda. But it requires a fast upskilling program to get there, and collaboration across traditional professional and professional body lines will be more important than ever. So today's session hopes to shed a light on the FM's role and impact driving down carbon emissions, what tools are available, the why and what of measurement, what problems to solve, and how to choose and leverage the supply chain to achieve outcomes. Once the panel have introduced themselves, Chris will do a short presentation covering some of those points I just mentioned, and we will then turn to questions with the panel. And can I please ask the audience to please just start sending in any questions you may have into our Q&A box, not the chat function. And if you want to remain anonymous, then please just add Anon before your name. So Chris, Luke, and Reid, thank you for joining us. May I please ask you to introduce yourself, and I'll start with you, Chris.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Chris Havers. I am a program director at a sustainability consultancy called Aclara Advisory, and we run the Sustainable Facilities Management Index, which is an industry-focused organization which is driving FMs to become ESG leaders.
Thank you. Reid, would you like to go next? Reid?
I was on mute. It had to happen. Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Reid Cunningham. I'm from BAM FM. I've been with BAM about 23 years. And I also sit on the IWFM Sustainability Special Interest Group. During my time in the Special Interest Group, I have also authored the IWFM guidance note on energy benchmarking. And in 2021, I participated in the steering group for Syria publication on environmental good practice for FM managers. In BAM, I'm responsible for the sustainability activities and strategy for BAM FM, and I'm also responsible for a division that we call BAM Energy, which is focused on renewable and low carbon energy services. As part of my role with FM and sustainability, as Sophie introduced, I'm responsible for leading the work and support that we're giving to Chris and his team at SFMI for the preparation of this new guidance that we intend to publish for Scope 3.
Brilliant. And last but definitely not least, Luke, please.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Luke Redbond. I work for Zurich Insurance in the UK. So my role primarily for Zurich is to look after sustainability for our buildings. And obviously that incorporates everything FM related. So everything from food all the way through to our energy and electricity usage as well. So very much coming from the client side, I suppose. So sort of rather than the sort of the FM angle. So here to give a slightly different perspective on things, which I'm hopeful that you'll find insightful. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Chris, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I've got the mouse key as well. So yeah, it's a bit of an introduction then. Thank you, Sophie, for the great introduction about the role of FM. I think that was perfectly eloquently put, actually, and a lot better than I would do it. So what I want to be talking into really before we get into the panel discussion is discussing Scope 3 emissions, carbon emissions, bit in general is a bit of an upskilling process for those who may not be aware of what they are and how they affect businesses, and then also understanding the application of those and why they're relevant to an FM organisation, and also this kind of leap to zero carbon. I mean, also there's other things like net zero as well. So there's lots of terms to describe these approaches. And I'm also want to. So I also want to talk about the launch of a report that Reed's team and I have been working on as well, which is kind of the tools for the FM community to be utilised in order to upskill itself and build its reputation. So the SFMI, very, very quickly, is a purpose-led organisation, and it works with FM providers in order to drive ESG leadership within the industry. And we do that by delivering a series of sustainable services that will provide positive benefits across the value chain. So here we're looking at annual assessments where we go in and we assess how sustainable an organisation is according to our understanding of FM and how services are delivered. We also conduct research, which is really primarily what we're going to be talking about today. But then also we deliver strategic solutions as well, and we also bring together organisations in forum in kind of forum events, and also providing webinars ourselves, free to attend webinars in order to upskill the organisations. In fact, we're doing one in about an hour and a half, in fact. So, but why do we do this? Because we believe that FM has the opportunity to make a serious impact in the built environment in terms of how buildings are operating to a sustainable standard. And it can do this because it is on the ground. It's, so to speak, at the coalface. It's operating, it's maintaining buildings, it's working with individuals on the ground. It can change behaviour. They're purchasing lots of different tools and equipment and goods and services. So there's buying value, which can be brought into the equation. And it's about how to use resources efficiently as well in order to create those sustainable environments for people to be working in. Obviously, there's lots of different barriers involved, but the SFMI is trying to help organisations to overcome these barriers. and to build that reputation to become ESG leaders. As I mentioned before, so this is how we split the work that we do into research, assessment, strategic solutions, and also collaboration events. For those of you who are very new to the whole greenhouse gas emissions thing, what we do when we look at a corporate inventory is we split this information into 3 ways: scopes 1, scopes 2, and scopes 3. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a second, but some general broad level information. So approximately 30% of UK emissions come directly from the built environment. And if we imagine the built environment as it is now, all of the building stock, we've got buildings from many, many years ago, decades or centuries ago, and then we've got the more recent buildings from like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and obviously the new builds happening today. Throughout history, these have all been built to lots of different standards, which have ebbed and flowed in quality over those decades. Now, basically 80% of our current building stock in 2050 already exists today. So there's a lot of potentially inefficient building. Well, there are a lot of massively inefficient buildings out there. And firstly, a building consists of embodied emissions. So to create and construct those buildings, obviously you've got to create the cement, you've got to create the steel. That has a lot of embodied carbon because of the manufacturing process that goes on. And then obviously you've got the carbon of the build itself. But once a building is built, there are emissions that occur from that as well. Now, FM hasn't been particularly good at measuring the impact that it has on the operational use of a building. So currently, when we look at the built environment, a lot of the data around what impacts buildings have is based around that embodied carbon that goes into it, and then also a little bit of the energy, and then also primarily the energy use of the building once it happens. So we believe that there's a larger impact which FM has in this, and so what we're doing is we're embarking on a journey in order to actually collect the data and then be able to present this information to show what is the impact that FM can have on the built environment, in order to understand the influence that an FM can have, whether it be within its own organization or as an outsourced provider, the impact that it can have on its clients. So as I mentioned before, so this complex looking diagram is essentially the carbon lifespan of a building. The dotted line in the middle is what is currently carved out as the operational use of the operational impact of carbon. And as you can see, you have something in there which talks about operational energy use and operational water use. Now, we believe that in order to create sustainable buildings, there's actually more understanding into this operational phase of a building. And so we believe that there's a larger impact within that operational use of buildings. But as I mentioned before, we need to go through this approach in order to collect this information and present this information to the wider built environment community. So that's what we're embarking on now, because we want to be changing perceptions of the reputation of FM and how it can impact this carbon life cycle of buildings. Because when you think about it, buildings are used to bring people together. So is it right to say that an impact of a building is only about the embodied material carbon and the use of the energy? Because you have equipment which is being used within that building as well, all of the goods and services which are used in order to operate and build and utilize that building. You've got people traveling to and from buildings, and all of this has an impact as well. So this information, this data is vital in order to understand how can FM actually have an impact, and how can we actually maybe accurately represent what a building's emission is. So what we'll do now is just have a look at when we look at carbon emissions targets, the SFMI spends a lot of time working with FM providers. And what we found is that when an FM provider is calculating its emissions, you have 4 tiers of how that organization will calculate its emissions. First of all, we have scopes 1 and 2. Now, what this is the direct fuel use of those organizations. So let's say you have BAM, for example. It will have its headquarters and it will have its vehicles which move around the country, and then it'll have a couple of satellite offices around the country as well. So within those directly owned buildings and vehicles, they will use either electricity or petrol or perhaps backup fuel generators or things like that. So these emissions, because they're directly owned by the company, that falls under their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's relatively easy to calculate. We can get the meter information, we can calculate that into carbon. It's all relatively straightforward when you know what you're doing. Then we get into scope 3. Now, this is the indirect emissions of an organization. So this can be split into the easier scope 3 stuff and then the more advanced scope 3 stuff. So on the easier side, we have travel emissions, for example. So let's say Reed needs to go on a business meeting up to Scotland and he decides to fly, he'll go from Scotland down to London and he wants to fly. He will go to the airport, he will purchase a ticket from British Airways or EasyJet, and he will say, and because those companies own the plane, therefore their direct emissions are the emissions that come from that plane. But because Reed is buying a ticket, that means that it's part of his indirect emissions. That's his scope 3, because BAM don't own the planes, but they're still using a seat on the train. And then there's other things like the waste that's generated in operations. You send your waste off to the recycling centres or the landfill, and the emissions are occurring on site of another organisation's operational boundary, but it's still stemming from your impact on the environment. And then we get into the wider, more advanced scope 3 stuff. So this is all of the goods and services which BAM or Zurich are purchasing in order to be running as a business. So this could be the paper that's being purchased, or even things like tools in order to do the work that's being conducted. All of these things are made by other organizations, but you're purchasing them, and therefore it has an impact. Even things like data centers, putting your information onto the cloud, your business information onto the cloud through data centers. It's owned by Microsoft or Amazon, AWS, but you're still putting your information on there. So those emissions are happening indirectly because of you. So all of these things we can actually measure the carbon impact of. And then the hardest side, so if we're looking at an FM provider, the hardest side is you have an FM organization with its direct operations, and then lots of staff are based on sites. So for example, BAM may have people working on site at Luke's facilities doing the work. So Luke mentioned about catering. They could outsource that work to a company like BAM, and therefore the FM provider will provide staff on site doing the catering work, but it's within the operational boundary of Zurich. So therefore this creates a bit of a kind of a dilemma about how are those emissions calculated? Where do they fall? Now, obviously they're going to fall within Zurich's emissions boundary, but we believe that because FM should be, as Sophie was saying at the beginning of the discussion, FM should be taking a higher responsibility in order to become more strategically positioned within organizations. The FM provider should be trying to understand what its carbon impact is for its customers, and then calculating this, which allows them to put their services on a zero carbon emissions route. So therefore, it's doing a bit more, it's doing more of the heavy lifting, but actually it's providing more of service to its customer, because it's saying, if you use our catering services, this is the trajectory that you're going to be on for our impact on your organization. So this is where we're going with this work that we're doing. So kind of summarized a few problems which we're trying to address with this work that we're releasing on the 8th of June. Number one, FM needs to have more of a strategic impact through the services that it delivers, or it does risk, a disruptive technology company which can offer cheaper services. So, we believe this is a potential systemic risk for FM, and we believe that FM needs to be delivering more value and more strategic value in order to kind of keep its position. So, as we've mentioned during this webinar, we believe that by transforming FM into sustainable FM solutions providers, it can actually be aligning itself with zero carbon targets and delivering more value and becoming more strategically important, which means that any cheaper services that come out, which can potentially disrupt the industry, will have less chance of holding because you're getting more value from the sustainable FM model. Number two, FM does need to build its reputation in sustainability in order to be able to deliver this extra value. Now, I mentioned earlier around the difficulties of measuring emissions. Now, if we look at the range of targets within the FM industry, the FM provider industry, we will actually see that there's lots of net zero targets, lots of zero carbon targets out there. But if you look at the scope and boundary of those targets, then actually there's a big array, because some companies will put out a net zero target based on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Another company will add a little bit of scope 3 emissions in there. Very few will add a full array of scope 3 emissions. And I think no companies are actually considering their customer impacts within those zero carbon targets as well. So what we want to do is actually create an industry standard, which is getting all companies along the same page to say, to build the reputation in the industry, all companies should be working from the same hymn sheet. And so if you're creating a big fanfare about a net zero target, then actually it's a good target. It's not something which is just solely based on the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then finally, FM providers, in their defense, are actually hamstrung by lots of restrictive contracts, which is actually becoming a bit of a barrier to delivering this greater value, because it means more money is required in order to go the extra mile. But we believe then that with the right tools and the right reputation, then FM can be engaging with those customers in order to measure the impact and create an environment whereby these restrictive contracts are actually broken down. These restrictive walls are broken down, and actually the organization can start to have more of that strategic impact because it's got the data to back it up, and that data is backed up with a good reputation and the numbers. So that's why we're releasing this scope 3 emissions in FM research, because we want to be helping FM, we want FM to be in a position where it's a key component in delivering zero carbon in the built environment and deliver improved operational building performance and reducing direct and indirect emissions for businesses that they work within. So it's a 4-stage approach, and we're launching stage 1 on the 8th of June, which is essentially us saying, here's the boundaries, here's the playing field. This is what we believe that FM companies should be doing. But then also, here's the tools in order to engage either customers if you're an FM provider, or if you're an FM in-house team, here's the tools in order to engage your in-house organization. Say, here's the value that we have, and in terms of measuring carbon impact, and actually here's the impact that we can have to reduce the impact that our service has on the business. which can then feed into an in-house organization's zero carbon targets. Stage 2, which we want to be launching after the summer, will be actually bringing a number of companies together in order to test this approach and actually start to collect real data and build up a carbon tool, which will allow us to be collating that real information, which we can then use in order to understand the real impact of FM at the same time. And then this develops further on so that we can launch wider to the FM industry. So taking the beta tool and then taking that to the wider industry, and then also building a globally recognized decarbonisation pathway for the FM industry. So the approach is sponsored by BAM. Thank you very much to Reed and the team. But then also we brought on a series of organisations, both from the FM providers, but then also in-house organisations and also industry bodies as well, who have been part of this critical review panel, where we've been meeting up, talking about the approach, getting feedback, and then getting consultation feedback from that. And what we're releasing on the 8th is essentially the results of that. So very quickly, I think just to quickly mention, so we've got two approaches to measuring emissions that the report will go through. Number one will be an emissions inventory method, which will essentially set what we see as the rule book for measuring an FM provider's corporate inventory, which will go into the scopes 1, 2, and the scopes 3 emissions according to the greenhouse gas protocol, and then also start to tackle the nitty-gritty issues around customer allocation emissions as well. So that will be applicable to FM providers. And then number 2, which will be an engagement tool, and it will be applicable to both FM providers engaging with their clients, but then also in-house FM teams engaging with their business. And ultimately, it'll be a tool which allows you to understand the activities of the FM function, work through that in a logical way, understand what you can have influence over and responsibility over, and then scoring that information, and then be able to come out the other end and say, okay, if we're going to have an impact on your net zero carbon numbers, this is what will form as part of the boundary based on the work that we're doing and our responsibility levels. Because ultimately, every single contract or every single FM FM team will have different responsibilities. So there's not going to be one exact way of doing that. So we've created this engagement tool in order for you to take away in a bespoke way and engage with your business. So that's that. Keep an eye out for that. It'll be launched on the 8th of June. It'll be launched on the Aclara Advisory website within the SFMI section of that. And also Reed will be launching that at the IWFM conference. So that's me.
Thank you, Chris. And we've already started to get in some very interesting questions. And can I please encourage people to keep on sending in questions? Rather than going with a broad question, I think a very important question came through from Paul Morris around scope 1 and 2 emissions and then scope 3 emissions. If every organisation fully addresses its scope 1 and 2 emissions, then scope 3 emissions fall away. And I think I had a bit of a moment as well when you mentioned that example of the BA plane and Reed buying a ticket, and in effect both of you kind of measuring your impact on the scope 3. But can I ask the panel why can you answer the question?
Yeah. So from my point of view, this goes into the value. So we're not at that point where every single business out there is reducing their emissions, their direct emissions, in order to create a zero carbon world. But what we're in a position of is where FM needs to be acting to become more strategically valuable to organizations as part of its business model. So my argument would be that if FM takes the initiative and is actively reducing and trying to influence elements of that scope 3. There are always going to be elements that you can't influence, but there are going to be elements that you can. And if FM wants to be in the game and strategically important when it comes to carbon emissions, then it needs to be taking responsibility rather than shying away from things and saying that's someone else's responsibility. This is not ours. I
think, Reid, you would like to come in.
Yeah, just to build on the point, I suppose that until we are measuring and taking the scope 3 stuff seriously, then even though scope 1 and 2 are being dealt with by maybe third parties up or down the supply chain, I think there won't be the same scrutiny and measurement of improvement and incentive to improve for those third parties, if we're not measuring it. So I think with any without too much of a headwind, if scope 3 starts being reported upon, it will put FM contractors and supply chains and material suppliers and all sorts of people, it will put the spotlight on them to be improving their scope 1, 2, and effectively that scope 3 emission, make improvements on that. And ultimately, the question is right, that those carbon emissions should come down and down and down. Whether or not they get to zero remains to be seen on a kind of service by service or product by product level. But I think starting to measure scope 3 will have a big incentive into the improvement, and indeed of FM contractors themselves. So what we're anticipating is that our customers, like Luke and Luke's peers, will start asking FM contractors to be reporting on scope 3 and having plans to improve it, and in doing so, the scope 1 and 2, effectively the 3 to Luke as well, will get better and better as a result of that.
Great, thank you. Moving to a slightly broader question, where do you think FM is as an industry in the understanding of measuring carbon emissions? And I'd really like to have both Luke and Reid's perspective, because one in-house, other service provider. Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I don't mind going first this time. That's absolutely fine. So thanks, Sophie. So yeah, I mean, I think, so just talking from the perspective of Zurich, so there's a real focus at the moment on operational emissions. So we've set ourselves some pretty stretching targets around reaching net zero by 2030, which is something that we've actually brought that forward from 2050. But there is an element of recognition that FM and FM related activity does contribute a lot to that. So for example, if we look at our UK business in 2021, which is the unit that I work for, that actually 30% of our UK emissions I should caveat that by saying the UK emissions that we're measuring, so this is primarily from commuting, travel, gas, electricity, waste, etc., paper, that is actually coming from buildings or related to buildings. And so actually we are in a position where we are able to say, well, actually, we have a sizable opportunity here as an FM section of the business to be able to influence the emissions. And so I think we do have a seat at the table, and the business recognizes that. But I think where we face a bit of a challenge is, I think sustainability at Zurich is more than just the emissions piece. It's more than just the 1.5 degree future. It's also about data. It's also about the sustainability of the business itself, customers, staff, jobs, diversity and inclusion. All of those things we consider to be part of our sort of sustainability strategy, and therefore the FM piece is in the scheme of things is a very small piece, albeit from an emissions perspective, like I said, has a significant scope.
Well, we could have an entire discussion around that, because I would firmly say that some of those other elements fall within the FM scope as well, because I really like what you're saying around the sustainability piece. that it is much wider than the environment piece, and especially the current net zero piece, because the economic and the social elements of sustainability really shouldn't be forgotten about, because how can we really make sure that we drive emissions down when people are very focused on where their next meal is coming from? And I keep on using that example, but it's not going to happen because it's so current at the moment. Sorry, Neil, I felt the need to respond that sustainability is the wider piece. Reid, where are BAM?
Yeah, so I think if I touch on BAM for a moment, and then maybe a slightly wider kind of context as well for the industry, as I see it, okay, speaking for myself. BAM have been very interested in sustainability since, well, for about 20 years, but since 2007, we've been listed as a corporate entity on the Climate Disclosure Project's A-list. So that's, you know, real leader in reporting and trying to take positive action. And we were amongst the first contractors in the UK to have our carbon reduction targets approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, where we're aiming to have our carbon reduction about 50% from a 2015 base by 2030. And we're making really good progress with that stuff. But here's one of the catches, and this might not be unique to BAM, but it's certainly not completely unique. But because we're part of a group, a lot of this reporting is made for your, you know, top level corporate entity, and actually being able to divide up individual targets or contributions to a total reporting amount get a little bit fuzzy as you go through group companies, particularly international groups. So what's really interesting for us, I suppose, is the variation that you get between corporate entities and how the FM entity, like BAM FM in the BAM corporate family, you know, what's our responsibility to that? And we can kind of work it out, scope 1, scope 2. And we've got components of the scope 3, a little bit like Luke was describing. You know, we know how much waste we deal with in FM alone, and we know about our business travel and some components like that. But it's not been clearly reported individually. So that in itself is a kind of interesting observation. And it's not unique, but not all FM companies will suffer that either. So you know, it's an interesting place. I think the other thing that is really interesting, taking a step out of just BAM, you know, I think we see it in our supply chain, but I tried to do a little bit of research through the construction line, which I know it's got the word construction in it. So sometimes us as an FM profession in an industry, we can maybe turn it off a little bit, but actually the construction line has many FM supply chain partners in it. There's several thousand supply chain partners in the UK in construction line, which is a kind of procurement portal that maintains kind of quality control around sort of is it ISO 90 sort of procurement rules around contractors. What was interesting, we have added sustainability criteria to the question set for all of those suppliers. And what's really interesting, if I think of BAM FM and you know, some other FM tier 1 contractors, you know, I think we're really interested in the scope 3 piece and measuring our scope 1 and 2 for corporate reporting. However, our supply chain at level, say tier 2 or tier 3, are not necessarily required to do any corporate reporting in many cases, and many of them don't even have a carbon strategy. So we've got a real issue about engaging with our supply chain to get them up to speed with where our customers and say our tier 1 FM contractors aspire to be. Because without that, you know, we're in a really difficult place. We need them to be signing up to the same issues, particularly around these products and services issues that Chris is talking about. So our scope 3 includes all of our supply chain, and we really need them to be participating with us in the plans for improvements. And right now, I think that's still an area for some development. So that's a bit of a kind of comment, Sophie, on where I think we are right now.
Thank you, Reid. Then the kind of logical follow-up question from that is, how can we improve that collaboration when there is still a huge awareness piece to be done? How can clients leverage their supply chain? Reid,
yeah, well, I jump in. Okay, so I mean, I think whilst the FM industry and the members of Chris's Sustainable FM Index, I think Chris is maybe about 25 what I would describe as tier 1 contractors, FM contractors in SFMI, for example. I think they are all quite motivated and interested in pursuing improved sustainability across all the 23 criteria that SFMI measure. So first of all, I think there is a lot of willingness and momentum. However, I think, as we've already said, and as Luke has illustrated as well, it's really helpful if we've got a customer that's on board too. When Chris was talking about how the guidance kind of works, what the challenges are. If we've got a customer who's willing to kind of put a value to this, to scope 3 and carbon reduction, then that's enormously helpful, because as willing partners we can think about this kind of carbon inventory together and make positive action, rather than have that kind of break between the responsibility and the contract, which kind of leaves nobody quite influencing or implementing the improvements that could be potentially there to be made. And I think then, if customers are on board and these 25 or more tier 1 companies are on board, then it's for us as an FM industry to go to our supply chain and do some heavy lifting there, and workshop and use people like the Supply Chain Sustainability School. We have some wonderful resources to upskill that. Now, I have one kind of little case study, if we've got time for me to share it. It's something I've shared a couple of times. I shared it last week on the IWFM evening seminar on World FM Day, where we had a supplier who made light fittings, and largely they're a big supplier to BAM, because BAM use a lot of light fittings. But BAM FM, we also replace a lot of light fittings, particularly with LED fittings. And we decided that we wanted to try out a kind of circular economy project. So that's about embodied material, but it's also about embodied carbon, which is relevant to this. And what we found we could do is actually not throw luminaire bodies made of steel and aluminium and the reflector pieces, not throw that in the bin, but actually retrofit LED technology, which is enormously energy efficient, but retain the whole of the back box and the reflector. And we saved several thousand kilograms of material by doing that. And we had a supplier who we'd done some workshops with about exploring how possible is this. And when it came to actually doing a trial, they completely participated in that. And interestingly, as a result, they've now created a whole new product line, which is cradle to cradle certified, with kind of low carbon, low plastic material content, and also modular, so that similar upgrades could be made very simply in the future. So, this is actually happening now. It's really exciting. And we need to find more projects like that.
Great. I would like to bring Luke back in, because from a client perspective, how do you see where you can, improve that working together, that collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my perspective, there's two comments to make here. So the first one is what we do at the moment is we've implemented, we did it a few years ago, is a supplier code of conduct. So our procurement team effectively have created this code of conduct, and it's very much, it's very much around sustainability. There's obviously some fundamental legal things that we have to have in there that are standard procurement items, but this is very much focused on sustainability and how those businesses operate, and them putting the emphasis on them, and to Reed's point about making sure they have their own strategies for net zero or reducing their emissions, etc. And that's part of our procurement process. So that's one thing that we're actively doing to contribute to that from the client side. And then I think a smaller thing, but also an important thing, and very much related to the FM side of things, is we've obviously over the last few months we've actually changed our FM provider, and in doing that we've as part of that switchover, we've actually insisted on having a responsibility manager appointed by our FM provider. And obviously they work very closely with me, and obviously what that does is it really puts the emphasis on sustainability. There is somebody for the FM provider who is acting on their behalf, working with a lot of their suppliers to gather information, ascertain, different, making sure we've got sustainable products and we're challenging the products that we use at the moment, and like I said, just ultimately driving activity. So it drives activity within the business. For me, it drives activity within their business as well. So a really sort of couple of interesting insights into what we do and how we work from that, and obviously all of that contributes to the reduction of those emissions, including the Scope 3 ones.
Thank you, Chris. I would like to bring you back into the conversation with a question really about why do you think FM is positioned well to deliver emission savings?
Yeah, it's the essentially operating buildings is its forte. There's the actions within, so businesses will occupy a building, and they will be their key function is to be doing whatever their business is in order to earn the money. And so therefore the FM function, its function is to ensure that building is operating effectively, but actually it should be also ensuring that building is operating efficiently, and in order to save money, but then also to adhere to climate change targets and things in a modernizing world. So when you have a function which is able to, as Reed said, conduct the retrofitting of a building in a particular way, whereby it can reduce carbon through that way, or if you're understanding the way that the building works, you're maintaining maintaining the operations within it, such as the air conditioning units, the boilers, all of the heating systems and such, then those can be maintained effectively and make decisions on what the replacements are and how efficient they can run. And then also mixing that with the comfort of the building users as well, because obviously understanding what building users want from the building, and in order to do that, then it's got a finger in lots of different pies, and therefore can bring all of those problems together and create solutions in order to ensure that the business that is working within the building is able to do their thing, but then also that it has as minimal impact on the environment and also on social issues as well at the same time.
Thank you for that. I think you call it finger in the pie, we call it linchpin.
That's a good one.
And we obviously want to be able, for our profession, to really demonstrate the value that they add beyond all that operational work that is being done. At the same time, we do see the rise of the Chief Sustainability Officer, for example, and Luke, to come back to you, you are not an FM yourself, but your business title, your title is UK Business and Engagement and Sustainability Lead. How do you see those different professions really working together to achieve the best possible outcomes? And how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, so I think from the perspective of a CSO, we've actually recently announced that our Chief Operating Officer for the UK will become a Chief Sustainability Officer. So and I think that's a real step forward for us, recognising the significance of this work and moving someone, who's that important in the business into that sort of role. I think what we're seeing over time, certainly in FM, we are seeing more of a focus on sustainability. And I think, like you said, there wasn't a role that existed around sustainability 10 years ago in our FM team. And actually, until probably 3 or 4 years ago, it was maybe 25% less than that of one person's role. And so I think we're really seeing, whereas, now it's not on average, it's 50% of my job. So I think going forwards, it will be 100% of somebody's job, probably by the time we get to next year. So you can really see how fast it's moving and how the significance of it is increasing over time, particularly with a business like ours. And like you said, that's, I'm just talking about our sort of FM related team there, looking after buildings and food, etc. And so you can see how it's changing and developing.
Okay, great. And how is that FM role positioned within the Zurich carbon strategy?
So I mean, I guess what I would say is that it's not just, although it's a UK role, there is a lot of reporting that we do into our group business as well. So there's very much the focus on delivering the UK strategy for sustainability on in relation to sort of buildings and facilities management. But then we also contribute to the group emissions by, effectively providing them the data with the overall bits and pieces. And then we work very closely with them on how we can drive changes and how we reduce our emissions, as well as having a sort of like a local strategy. So it's a little bit of a top down and a bottom up approach, if you like, and that role then sort of fits in the middle of those two and works with the UK and the group, the sort of the central HQ business too.
Great, thank you. I want to pick up on something that you've mentioned around the data collection piece, because our own sustainability survey really showed that clear gap and lack of data. And of course, if you don't have the data, how do you drive forward? How do you set targets? How do you set a roadmap even? How do you make decisions? And Reid, I'd like to bring you back in, and Chris as well. How do FM providers position themselves in the carbon strategy? And where do you really think that the role is for data collection and making improvements around that?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in first if you like, Chris. I think what we've seen is a kind of prelude to the scope 3 piece coming with the scope 1 and 2, and it was a bit of a soft, gentle entry, because that should have been data that's easy to gather. As Chris was saying right at the start, it's stuff that's either metered or it's billed and you pay for it somehow. So it should have been quite easy. However, even now, when quite often when I talk to a customer about their energy data, I still get past 12 months of bills. And this isn't really data at all. It's just 12 months of bills. It's not telling you in any detail the kind of information that's useful to understand half-hour profile data and where you might be able to make efficiency savings. So I know many of us on this call will have lots of half-hour data, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, but out there in the big wide world, there's a lot of existing FM provision that has nothing better than monthly bills from their supplier. I guess I'm just setting the scene for the fact that that should be easy, and yet it actually still isn't happening all that consistently and all that well. So when you then turn towards the more difficult challenge of scope 3, then I think organizations who have good data collection are going to be in a much better place to gather and analyze and allocate their emissions to individual contracts. You know, one of the comments, I maybe didn't make it very well earlier, one of my comments earlier about the group and then, you know, the FM entity is the FM entity might have a good idea of its total emissions, but allocating that, as Chris was saying, through the top down or the bottom up approach to individual customers, that's quite a big change, quite tricky. And I guess that will be the focus of a lot of the work we're going to be doing between 2022 and 2023 is maybe allocating typical service carbon sort of an intensity to do with the service, so that we can allocate different kind of carbon intensities to different type of services for a top-down approach to become a little bit more accurate. Or
Thanks.
For individual products on the bottom-up approach to be allocated to the carbon intensity that we can all allocate consistently. But the data it can be tricky, and everything is going to revolve around that.
Thank you, Reid. I'm very conscious of time and the many questions that are still outstanding. Chris, I do want to bring you in on a question from Tracy. Will the standard address the issues of Scope 3 where FM providers need to apportion emission data to various clients in the chain? That's a very nice question, but I think
yes, it does. So this is kind of the tricky one, which a tricky issue that we try and tackle, because obviously you have an FM provider who's delivering services across the board, but then each service will have a lot of niches to it based on the contract that's being provided. So this is essentially the reason why we've come up with two tools, should we say. The first one is this kind of corporate emissions inventory that all FM providers, well, what we recommend all FM providers to approach to the fullest extent possible. And that will have a basic allocation of emissions towards its customers, which because of the nature of doing a corporate-wide inventory and then lacking the resources to go into individual contracts, you know, and having these issues around, you know, well, we're on site for this, but we're not on site, and you know, you do this and we do this, then this creates a bit of a problem. So that's why the first approach, which we recommend to all corporations that run FM businesses, take this approach to measuring their emissions, and then that comes with an allocation approach, which is a simplistic approach. Then the second tool is for those companies who are really keen and really interested in understanding what your impact is on their business through your service. This is this engagement tool which allows you to hone in and start to identify which parts of your responsibilities you actually have an influence on and responsibility for. A key example would be like, let's say, we'll go back to catering because that's been mentioned a couple of times. Some clients will say, you know, you have to have this on the menu, this on the menu, and this on the menu. You know, it's all very restrictive, and therefore it leaves the FM with very little room to maneuver in order to make reductions. And so therefore it will be, you know, a bit harsh on the FM provider to say that they have to get to near zero carbon when the client is putting all the restrictions on. However, if you find going through the method that there are areas to influence where if you relax the restrictions a little bit, then actually that creates more flexibility and you can have more influence. Then you can have that engagement piece with the client. So, okay, if we make a little amend here or a little amend here, then actually we can have a greater impact on your net zero emissions because we have more responsibility over and we're able to take more ownership over it. So yeah, it does tackle that unfortunate dilemma within the industry.
We've got a question from Robert Chapman as well, whether there is awareness amongst the panel about the launch today of the UK net zero carbon building standard. And I think the consensus, and I will speak for the panel on this occasion, I think, is that it doesn't necessarily have great FM representation. So we are aware of it, but we are going to start collect data. Well, actually, Chris, this is what your project is aiming to do, to collect data to help inform that entire piece.
Right, yeah. I think FM's been not particularly good at collecting that information, presenting it to go into this wider building life cycle impact. So that's what we're trying to do and hope to influence it in the future.
And then also making sure that its voice is represented amongst the life cycle. I think we have got a little bit of work to do. Now, I'm very conscious of time, and we haven't been able to discuss like the cost impact of some of this activity because it will cost more at times. But I just want to ask the question, one last question with a 30-second, 20-second answer each. I'm looking at you, Reid. What should people in FM be doing to understand how they can play a role in carbon management? Really, what is your top tip? 20 seconds each.
Do you want to go me first? I'll get out of the way.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think the two top tips. One top tip would be try and start gathering data about activities, whether it's the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, because we need to be gathering it all. The second piece is about speaking with the supply chain and material and service providers, because we need to understand what's involved from their point of view and how they can report into us on that.
Great. Chris, you're still unmiked.
Yep, I would say, yeah, understand the activities that you perform and understand what that means for emissions and where you can get the data from in order to understand what your impact can be.
Thank you. And Luke?
Yeah, thanks. I would echo Reid's comment about data. I think that's fundamental, but I would also say don't overlook anything. There's potential everywhere in all things, whether it be water or food or waste or whatever, to help reduce those emissions. So you have a look at everything.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And really sorry that we couldn't get through all of the questions posed. And apologies as well for slightly overrunning. I just want to thank Chris, Reid and Luke. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you to the audience as well for joining us and asking us many questions. And I would like to do a little shout out to Lucy and Claire for the tech support today as well. It's clear that there is an opportunity to cement the profession at the centre of organisations and really helping to deliver some quite critical business outcomes. But picking up from the panel, understanding and measuring carbon related data really is quite key to making that impact and delivering those outcomes. If anyone is interested in contributing to the Scope 3 work, please get in touch via policy@iwfm.org.uk or with Chris Havers direct via LinkedIn, and I think he listed his email address as well. Thank you very much for attending, and hope to see you in person at our conference on the 8th of June. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.